Cold winds howl through the San Juan Mountains, masking secrets buried deeper than the snowdrifts. Stefan Montgomery ordered a sturdy, plain wife to survive the brutal winter. What arrived at the train depot was a silk-clad widow carrying a locked trunk, a loaded derringer, and a past that could get them both killed. Stefan Montgomery stood on the splintered boardwalk of Silverton, Colorado, his broad shoulders braced against the biting October wind. He was a man carved from the very granite of the San Juan Mountains, hard, quiet, and weathered. For 5 years, he had worked a solitary silver claim up on Animas Peak, coming down only when the coffee ran out or the loneliness became a physical ache in his jaw. At 32, he had decided he needed a wife. Not for love. Love was a luxury that froze to death at 10,000 feet. He needed a partner. A sturdy, plain-faced farmer's daughter who knew how to gut an elk, mend a wool coat, and keep the fire roaring when the blizzards buried the cabin. He had sent a letter east through Ezekiel Farnsworth, the local assayer, asking for just that. The stagecoach rattled into town, its wheels caked in frozen mud. Stefan stepped forward, calloused hands resting on his gun belt. The heavy wooden door swung open. Out stepped Joel Clara Sterling. Stefan stopped dead in his tracks. This was no farmer's daughter. The woman descending the iron steps looked as though she had been plucked from a Boston opera house. She wore a tailored traveling suit of deep burgundy velvet, a matching hat pinned over immaculately coiled chestnut hair, and delicate leather boots, entirely unsuited for the jagged rocks of the frontier. She was staggeringly beautiful, with high cheekbones and striking amber eyes that darted around the rough-hewn mining town with sharp, calculating intelligence. Zeke Farnsworth walked up beside Stefan, scratching his bearded chin. "Well, Montgomery, looks like your mail-order bride ain't exactly what you put in the catalog." Stefan scowled, striding toward the stagecoach. "There's been a mistake," he announced, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the noise of the street. "Ma'am, you must be on the wrong stage. I'm Stefan Montgomery. I was expecting a Mrs. Higgins from Ohio." Joel turned to face him. She did not flinch at his imposing height or the wildness of his thick, dark beard. Instead, she reached into her reticule and pulled out a crumpled, stained letter. His letter. "I am Joel Sterling," she said, her voice smooth but laced with a subtle tremor she fought hard to suppress. "Mrs. Higgins passed away of consumption 2 weeks before she was to leave. I purchased her ticket and your correspondence from her sister. I am your bride, Mr. Montgomery." Stefan stared at her, then at the heavy brass-bound trunk the stage driver was unceremoniously dropping onto the mud. "You bought my letter?" he asked, disbelief coloring his tone. "Lady, I live 3 miles up a mountain path that barely qualifies as a goat trail. The winter drops 10 feet of snow. The bears are hungry, and the wind will strip the skin right off your face. I need someone who can chop wood, not someone worried about wrinkling her velvet." "I assure you, Mr. Montgomery," Joel replied, lifting her chin defiantly, "velvet is the least of my concerns. I am stronger than I look, and I am not going back." Stefan saw the desperation in her amber eyes. It wasn't the look of a woman seeking a romantic frontier adventure. It was the frantic, cornered look of a hunted animal. Every instinct in his mountain-hardened mind told him to hand her a return ticket, put her on the next stage back east, and walk away. But the stagecoach driver was already whipping the horses, heading for the livery, and the next coach out wouldn't arrive for a month. Winter was closing in. "Grab your trunk," Stefan grunted, turning his back on her. "We've got a long walk." To his surprise, she didn't complain. She didn't ask for a porter. Joel grasped the heavy leather handle of the brass-bound trunk and dragged it through the freezing mud. It was agonizingly slow. By the time they reached the trailhead at the base of Animas Peak, her burgundy dress was stained brown, her breath came in ragged gasps, and her delicate hands were rubbed raw. Stefan offered no help, testing her resolve. He expected her to weep, to beg to return to town. Instead, she paused, ripped a wide strip of fabric from the hem of her expensive skirt, wrapped it around her bleeding palms, and picked up the handle again. The trek up the mountain was brutal. The air thinned, biting at their lungs like broken glass. Pine needles whipped their faces, and the incline was merciless. Stefan walked ahead, carrying his own heavy pack of supplies, occasionally glancing back. Joyle was always there, head bowed, dragging that unreasonably heavy trunk step by bloody step. As twilight descended, painting the snow-capped peaks in bruised shades of purple, they finally reached the clearing. The cabin was a modest structure of interlocking pine logs, fortified against the elements, with a stone chimney puffing thin, gray smoke. It was isolated, quiet, and aggressively lonely. Joyle dropped the trunk on the porch, collapsing against the wooden railing. She looked at the vast, empty wilderness stretching out for miles below them, then at the crude cabin. "It's not Boston," Stefan said, unlocking the heavy oak door. "Thank God," Joyle whispered, leaning her head back and closing her eyes. The first 3 weeks in the cabin were a masterclass in silent friction. Stefan was a man of strict routine. He woke before dawn, checked his trap lines, worked the silver vein with dynamite and pickaxe, and returned to chop wood until his muscles burned. He expected Joyle to fail. He anticipated the morning she would refuse to leave the warmth of the quilt, demanding to be taken back to civilization. But Joyle Sterling was a creature of stubborn contradictions. She possessed the refined etiquette of an aristocrat, yet she threw herself into the brutal labor of mountain life with a terrifying intensity. Within days, her velvet dresses were ruined, replaced by Stefan's oversized flannel shirts and worn denim trousers belted tightly around her slender waist. She learned to split kindling, though she nearly took off her own toe on the first attempt. She learned to make biscuits that didn't taste like ash, and she learned to gut the rabbits Stefan brought home, though her face went deathly pale the first few times she plunged her hands into the warm viscera. Despite her efforts, Stefan kept a wary distance. There were too many unanswered questions hanging in the frigid air between them. Why would a wealthy widow from the East pay for another woman's mail-order bride ticket to vanish into the Rockies? Why did she flinch whenever a sudden gust of wind rattled the heavy wooden shutters? And then there were the nightmares. Almost every night, from her small cot on the opposite side of the cabin, Joyle would toss and turn, her murmurs escalating into frantic, breathless pleas. Stefan would lie awake by the hearth, listening. Sometimes she cried out a name. "Amos!" "No, please, Amos. Don't let them." Stefan assumed Amos was her late husband. He pictured a cruel man, an abusive aristocrat whose ghost still haunted her. He wanted to ask, to bridge the growing divide between them, but words were a currency Stefan had long forgotten how to spend. Instead, he showed his developing care through actions. He secretly sharpened her skinning knife so she wouldn't struggle. He left an extra wool blanket at the foot of her bed while she slept. He began leaving the softer, choicer cuts of meat on her tin plate. One frigid afternoon in late November, the first major blizzard of the season slammed into Animus Peak. The wind shrieked like a banshee, threatening to tear the shingles from the roof. Stefan was forced to abandon the mine and stay indoors. The cabin was suffocatingly small, with both of them trapped inside. Joyle was kneading dough at the heavy oak table, her hands dusted in flour, a smudge of white across her cheek. Stefan sat by the fire, oiling his Winchester rifle. "You're getting better at that," Stefan noted, nodding toward the dough. It was the first time he had offered a genuine compliment. Joyle paused, looking up at him, a rare, genuine smile touching her lips. "Hunger is an excellent instructor, Mr. Montgomery. Though I confess, I would trade my soul for a single jar of cinnamon. I'll remember that when I go down to Silverton for the spring thaw." At the mention of Silverton, her smile vanished. Her eyes darted toward the window, obscured by swirling white snow. The fear returned, sharp and sudden. "Stefan," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was the first time she had used his Christian name. "When the thaw comes, do many strangers pass through the town?" "A few," Stefan replied slowly, setting the rifle aside. "Miners, mostly. Drifters looking to strike it rich." "Why, are you expecting someone, Josie?" She flinched at the nickname, retreating into herself. "No, no one." She turned back to the dough, attacking it with unnecessary force. The tension broke an hour later when the roof began to leak. melted snow dripping directly onto Joyle's prized, brass-bound trunk in the corner. "I'll patch the roof from the inside," Stefan said, standing up. "Help me move your trunk out of the drip line." "I can do it," Joyle said quickly, abandoning her baking and rushing over. "It weighs a ton, Josie. Just let me." Stefan grabbed the leather handle on one side, but the wet wood of the cabin floor was slick. As he yanked, the trunk caught on a raised floorboard. The brass lock, already battered from the brutal journey up the mountain, finally gave way with a sharp snap. The heavy lid flew open, spilling a portion of its contents onto the floor. Stefan froze. There were no fine silk gowns inside. There were no family heirlooms, no silver tea sets or photo albums of a life left behind. Scattered across the floorboards were thick, banded stacks of uncirculated Union Pacific Railroad bonds. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, worth a fortune. And resting atop the pile of stolen wealth was a heavy, silver-plated Colt revolver, a box of ammunition, and a folded wanted poster. Stefan reached down, picking up the heavy paper. The drawing was rough, but the face was unmistakable. Wanted. Dead or alive. Amos Sterling and unknown female accomplice. $5,000. Reward for info, leading to the recovery of stolen Union Pacific bonds. Stefan looked up slowly. Joyle was standing against the wall, her face drained of all color, her hand hovering near her waist, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "You aren't a widow fleeing an abusive husband," Stefan said, his voice cold, devoid of the warmth that had been building between them. "You're a fugitive." Joyle's chest heaved. She looked at the open trunk, then at Stefan, her amber eyes burning with a desperate, fierce fire. "Amos isn't dead," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "And he isn't my husband. He's my brother. And if he finds me, Stefan, he's going to kill us both." The wind outside howled louder, rattling the heavy wooden door of the cabin. But inside, the silence was deafening. Stefan looked at the fortune on his floor, the wanted poster in his hand, and the terrified, beautiful woman backed against his wall. The quiet, solitary life he had carved out of the mountain was gone, shattered the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. Now, the real storm was coming. Silence stretched tight enough to snap inside the small cabin. The only sound was the frantic popping of pine sap in the hearth and the merciless howling of the blizzard battering the roof. Stefan did not reach for his gun, nor did he lunge for the stolen wealth on the floorboards. Instead, he kicked the heavy brass lid of the trunk shut with the heel of his boot. The loud crack made Joyle jump. "Start talking," Stefan demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous gravelly register. "And do not insult me by leaving out the ugly parts." Joyle sank into the heavy wooden chair by the table, the fight suddenly draining from her posture. She looked at her flour-dusted hands, the blisters she had earned splitting his firewood now fully healed into tough calluses. "Amos is a monster," she began, her voice hollow. "He wasn't always. But the war changed him. He rode with Quantrill's raiders, and when the fighting stopped, he didn't know how to put away the blood. He turned to robbing rail cars. For years I covered for him. I lied to the marshals. I hid his bloodied coats. I was his respectable, widowed sister in Omaha, providing him with an alibi and a safe house." She looked up, her amber eyes swimming with unshed tears. "But 3 months ago, he planned to derail the Midnight Express outside Cheyenne, a passenger train, Stefan, over 200 people. He didn't just want the payroll safe. He wanted to massacre the guards to send a message to the Union Pacific. I begged him to reconsider, but he struck me." She touched her jaw, a ghost of a memory flitting across her face. "So, the night before he left, I took the bonds from his lockbox. I took his gun, and I ran. I knew without his war chest, his men would scatter, and the derailment would fail." "And the mail-order bride?" Stefan asked, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "A desperate improvisation. I saw Mrs. Higgins weeping at the train depot in Omaha. The consumption had ravaged her lungs. She was too weak to travel. I gave her sister $200 for her medicine, took your letters, and boarded the train. I figured the last place Amos would look for a city widow was in the frozen peaks of the San Juans. Stefan stared at her. The anger he expected to feel, the righteous indignation of a man lied to and used, was entirely absent. Instead, he felt a profound, begrudging respect. This woman had not fled out of cowardice. She had sacrificed her entire life, making herself a hunted fugitive to save a train full of strangers. She was tougher than the granite of Animus Peak. "If he finds you," Stefan said slowly, "he won't just kill you, he'll make it last." "I know," Joel whispered. "I'll pack my things. If the snow breaks tomorrow, I will hike down to Silverton. I won't bring his wrath to your door, Stefan. You didn't ask for this." She stood up, reaching for the trunk handle. Stefan stepped forward, his large, calloused hand clamping down over hers. The heat of his palm contrasted sharply with her cold skin. "You won't make it a mile in this powder," he said gruffly. "And I don't abandon my partners. The trunk goes in the mine, behind the false timber wall in the lower shaft. As of this moment, Joel Sterling is dead. You're Josie Montgomery now." Over the next 4 months, the brutal winter sealed them away from the rest of the world. Buried beneath 10 feet of snow, the cabin became a fortress of shared survival. The initial tension morphed into a deep, unspoken reliance. Stefan taught her how to handle the heavy Colt revolver she had stolen from her brother. He spent hours showing her how to aim, how to brace against the recoil, and how to clean the barrel until it gleamed. In return, Joel brought a terrifying, beautiful warmth to his desolate life. She read to him from the few battered books he owned, her cultured voice filling the empty silence of the mountain evenings. The physical distance between them shrank inch by inch. It culminated on a freezing night in February when the fire died down to embers. Shivering, Joel had pulled her cot closer to the hearth. Stefan, unable to bear the sight of her trembling, had silently brought his heavy bearskin rug and draped it over her, his hands lingering on her shoulders. She turned, looking up into his dark, weathered face. No words were spoken. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his thick hair, and pulled him down. The kiss was desperate, tasting of wood smoke, fear, and a fierce, undeniable hunger. That night, the invisible wall between the rugged mountain man and the runaway aristocrat crumbled entirely. They were no longer two strangers hiding from the world. They were a singular force, bound by blood, snow, and a love forged in the crucible of survival. Spring arrived in the San Juans with violent beauty. The ice cracked like cannon fire, and the snowmelt transformed the dormant creeks into roaring torrents of white water. By mid-May, the trail down to Silverton was finally passable. Stefan hitched the mules to the wagon. They were critically low on coffee, flour, and, more importantly, dynamite for the silver vein. "Stay inside the cabin," Stefan instructed, kissing Joel's forehead. He handed her the loaded Colt. "Keep the shutters barred. If anyone comes up the trail who isn't me, you don't ask questions. You fire." "Come back to me, Stefan," she said, her hands gripping his flannel shirt. The fear had returned to her eyes, mirroring the melting snow outside. The world was open again, and with it came the past. The muddy streets of Silverton were teeming with life when Stefan arrived. Miners, prospectors, and gamblers had flooded the town, eager to spend their winter wages. Stefan tied his mules outside the assayer's office and walked inside. Ezekiel Farnsworth looked up from his scales, his face instantly draining of color. "Montgomery," Zeke stammered, wiping his sweating brow with a dirty handkerchief. "You shouldn't be here." Stefan narrowed his eyes, his hand drifting instinctively toward his gun belt. "Need my supplies, Zeke? Have my orders arrived?" "Stefan, listen to me," Zeke hissed, leaning over the counter and dropping his voice to a frantic whisper. "There are men in town, 5 of them, hard cases. They've been flashing a drawing of a woman, offering $1,000 to anyone who's seen her. One of them, the leader. He's got dead eyes, Stefan. Wears a gray duster. He asked me specifically about the stagecoach manifests from last October." A block of ice formed in Stefan's stomach. Amos Sterling. "What did you tell him, Zeke?" Stefan asked, his voice deadly quiet. Nothing. I swear it on my mother's grave. But Stefan, the stage driver, old man Higgins, he was drinking at the Golden Nugget last night. He likes to talk. He might have mentioned dropping a fancy-looking woman off to a giant of a man at the Animus Peak trailhead. Stefan didn't wait to hear the rest. He tossed a gold nugget onto the counter, bolted out the door, and vaulted into his wagon. He didn't bother loading the flour or the coffee. He only grabbed the heavy crate of blasting caps and dynamite he had pre-ordered from the mercantile. He whipped the mules into a frenzy, tearing out of Silverton, the wagon wheels kicking up massive plumes of mud. He pushed the animals to their absolute limit, the wagon bouncing violently over the rocky ascending trail. As he neared the 3-mile mark, a sharp crack echoed through the valley. A bullet splintered the wooden bench inches from his thigh. Stefan hauled hard on the reins, diving into the bed of the wagon as another shot took out the lead mule. The animal collapsed, sending the wagon skidding into a snowbank. Stefan grabbed his Winchester and the crate of dynamite, rolling into the thick cover of the pine trees. Below him, on the switchback trail, he saw them. 5 riders, heavily armed, pushing their horses hard. At the front was a man in a gray duster, his face a grim mask of fury. Amos. Stefan sprinted the remaining half-mile up the mountain on foot, his lungs burning, the crate of explosives digging into his shoulder. He burst into the clearing. "Josie!" Stefan roared. The heavy cabin door swung open, and Joyle stood there, the Colt gripped tightly in both hands. She saw the blood on his cheek from the splintered wood and the wild look in his eyes. She knew instantly. "He's here," she breathed. "We have 10 minutes," Stefan said, rushing inside and dropping the crate. "They're on horseback, but the trail is steep. They'll have to dismount at the ridge." He began prying the wooden lid off the crate with his hunting knife. "We can't hold the cabin. The walls are thick, but the roof is dry pine. Amos will burn us out before sundown. We're moving to the mine." Joyle didn't panic. The winter had hardened her. She quickly packed their warmest coats, a lantern, matches, and all the ammunition they possessed. Stefan grabbed 3 sticks of dynamite, furiously wiring them to blasting caps. He ran outside, burying the explosives in the narrow choke point of the trail leading directly to the cabin porch, running the fuse wire back toward the tree line. "Let's go," Stefan commanded. They abandoned the cabin, sprinting toward the dark, gaping maw of the silver mine carved into the cliff face 50 yards away. They barely reached the heavy wooden support beams of the mine entrance when the first shout drifted across the clearing. "Joyle." The voice was cultured, smooth, and laced with absolute malice. Amos Sterling stepped into the clearing, flanked by 4 rugged outlaws, clutching repeating rifles. Amos looked at the smoking chimney of the empty cabin, then slowly dragged his gaze across the rocky terrain until his dead, shark-like eyes locked onto the darkness of the mine entrance. "You took my money, little sister," Amos called out, drawing a pair of silver-plated revolvers. "And you made me ride a very long way. Now, be a good girl and bring it out here. If you do, I promise I'll make the mountain man's death quick. If you make me come in there after it, I'll spend 3 days skinning him alive while you watch." Stefan crouched behind a pile of tailings, striking a match. He looked at Joyle, her face pale, but her hands steady. "Plug your ears," Stefan whispered, and touched the flame to the fuse. The fuse burned with a violent, spitting hiss, racing across the snow-dusted ground toward the buried charges. Stefan grabbed Joyle's arm, yanking her deep into the suffocating blackness of the mine shaft, just as the world outside erupted. The explosion tore through the tranquil mountain air with the force of a thunderbolt. The sheer concussive wave rushed into the mine entrance, knocking Stefan and Joyle off their feet and showering them in a cloud of pulverized rock and choking dust. Outside, the arrogant shouts of the outlaws turned into jagged screams. A shower of splintered wood and fragmented stone rained down on the clearing. Stefan didn't wait for the dust to settle. He hoisted himself up, ignoring the ringing in his ears, and pulled Joyle to her feet. He struck a match, the sulfur flaring bright against the oppressive dark, and lit the wick of their oil lantern. "Move," Stefan rasped, his voice rough with rock dust. That blast was meant to seal the choke point, not the entrance. Amos won't stop. They ventured deeper into the earth, the temperature dropping rapidly as they left the faint daylight behind. The Animus Peak silver mine was a labyrinth of Stefan's own making. Over 5 years, he had carved out main arteries and secondary drifts, leaving dead ends, unstable ceilings, and false timber walls. He knew every drop, every jagged outcropping, and every echo. From the entrance, the harsh, metallic click of a rifle lever action echoed down the main shaft. "You killed 2 of my boys, mountain man!" Amos's voice drifted through the tunnel, distorted and amplified by the stone walls. "But you're just delaying the inevitable. I brought lanterns, and we have enough ammunition to mine this rock with lead." Stefan ushered Joel behind a thick wooden support column near a fork in the tunnel. He handed her the Winchester rifle, keeping his own heavy revolver. "Take the right tunnel. It leads to the lower drift where we hid the trunk. Stay behind the false wall." "I am not leaving you," Joel whispered fiercely, her amber eyes reflecting the dim lantern light. "Josie, listen to me," Stefan urged, his calloused hands framing her face. "You don't know the layout in the dark." "I do. I am going to circle around the upper ventilation shaft and flank them. But I need you to stay out of sight." Before she could argue, a gunshot cracked, the bullet sparking viciously against the granite wall just 10 feet above their heads. Amos and his remaining 2 men were advancing quickly, their own lanterns casting long, monstrous shadows against the cavern walls. Stefan extinguished their lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. He gave her hand one last tight squeeze and slipped away into the black. Joel felt her way down the right-hand tunnel, her hand trailing along the damp, freezing stone. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She finally reached the dead end. Dropping to her knees and feeling for the slight draft of air that marked the false timber wall Stefan had built to hide his best silver strikes. She pried the loose board away, squeezed into the cramped, hollow cavity, and pulled the timber shut behind her. Her brass-bound trunk rested against her knees. She leveled the Winchester at the crack in the wood, her finger trembling on the trigger. Minutes dragged by in agonizing silence, broken only by the steady drip-drip of condensation. Then Amos's voice echoed again, closer this time, dripping with a terrifying, calm rationality. "You really thought I rode all the way to this frozen hellscape just for a few stolen train bonds, Josie?" Amos called out. The sound of his leather boots crunching on loose gravel filled the tunnel. "Those bonds were a fraction of the capital. The Pinkertons seized the Omaha accounts the day you fled. The entire syndicate's wealth is locked in New York ledgers, and you are the only one who memorized the cipher codes." Joel clamped her hand over her mouth, suppressing a gasp. Amos didn't want to kill her, he needed her. She was the key to his empire. "You're coming back with me, little sister," Amos continued, his lantern light now seeping through the cracks of her wooden hiding spot. "If you surrender now, I'll let your hairy brute of a husband bleed out in peace. If you don't, I will have my men hold him down while I break every joint in his hands." Suddenly, the deafening roar of Stefan's revolver shattered the monologue. A scream followed as one of Amos's men took a bullet in the dark. A frantic volley of return fire lit up the tunnels in strobe-like flashes of orange violence. "Stefan!" Joel screamed, unable to stop herself. "I hit him!" shouted Amos's last remaining man. "He's down in the cross shaft!" Panic overrode logic. Joel kicked the false timber wall outward. The heavy boards clattered to the stone floor. She stepped out of the hollow, stepping into the glaring beam of Amos's lantern. Her brother stood 50 feet away. His gray duster was covered in dust and blood, his face a terrifying mask of sociopathic calm. To his right, his surviving thug had his rifle aimed down a side tunnel where Stefan had fallen. "There she is," Amos smiled, a cold, dead expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Put the rifle down, Josie. It's time to go home." Joel's eyes locked onto the remaining thug, who was ruthlessly aiming his rifle down the dark cross shaft where Stefan had fallen. Time seemed to thicken, turning the damp cavern air into molasses. The refined, frightened widow who had boarded a train in Omaha was a ghost now, entirely consumed by the woman standing in her place, a woman forged in the brutal, unforgiving winters of the San Juans. She did not lower the Winchester. Instead, She raised the heavy walnut stock to her shoulder, pressing it firmly against her collarbone, just as Stefan had taught her. She lined up the iron sights, her amber eyes narrowing, her breathing perfectly still. She pulled the trigger. The heavy recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising the bone, but the shot flew true. The thunderous crack of the rifle echoed off the granite walls as the thug dropped his weapon, clutching his chest. He collapsed heavily onto the mining tracks, his lantern shattering and spilling burning oil across the stone. Amos barely blinked. He did not look down at his dying man, nor did his expression shift into anger or grief. His sociopathic calm was far more terrifying than rage. He simply raised his silver-plated Colt, tracking the barrel smoothly through the dim light until it was aimed directly at Joel's chest. The hammer clicked back, a sickening, sharp sound in the sudden quiet. "You always were a disappointment," Amos said softly, his voice devoid of any familial warmth. "Josie, get down!" Stefan's voice ripped through the cavern, a ragged roar of pure, desperate adrenaline. He staggered out from the shadows of the cross shaft, clutching his heavily bleeding left shoulder. His face was pale beneath a mask of rock dust, but his right hand was raised high, gripping a single, sputtering stick of dynamite. The fuse was burned down to a terrifyingly short nub, hissing violently. He didn't throw the explosive at Amos. That wouldn't guarantee their survival. Stefan locked eyes with Joel for a fraction of a second before throwing the dynamite straight up into the darkness, aiming for the massive, critically stressed timber beam that supported the main ceiling junction directly above her brother. "No!" Amos screamed, his cold facade finally breaking. He fired his Colt blindly at Stefan, realizing a second too late the sheer, suicidal scale of the mountain man's final play. Ignoring the bullets whizzing past his head, Stefan dove across the tracks. He tackled Joel backward, throwing them both deep into the cramped, hollow cavity of the false wall. He twisted in midair, wrapping his massive arms around her and shielding her fragile body entirely beneath his own, just as the dynamite detonated. The explosion was catastrophic, a concussive wave of heat and sound that defied comprehension. It didn't merely shatter the wooden support beam, it triggered a devastating chain reaction throughout the unstable, honeycombed rock above. The ceiling of the main junction groaned a deep, ancient sound like the earth itself tearing in half, and then thousands of tons of solid, jagged granite collapsed inward. The cave-in swallowed Amos Sterling entirely, burying him, his silver revolvers, and his cruel ambitions beneath an impenetrable mountain of stone. The immense shockwave violently knocked the breath from Joel's lungs. The world instantly went terrifyingly dark and silent, save for the horrifying roar of settling debris and the ragged, shallow breathing of the giant man lying on top of her. "Stefan," she coughed, her throat coated in bitter cordite and pulverized rock. She pushed frantically against his broad chest. His heavy body rolled limply to the side, terrifyingly unresponsive. "Stefan, talk to me, please." She fumbled blindly in the oppressive dark, her hands slick with the warm blood pouring from his wounded shoulder. Her fingers brushed against a dropped lantern. With trembling, desperate hands, she miraculously managed to strike a match against the stone floor. The sulfur flared, and she lit the wick, casting a weak, golden glow over the confined space. Stefan was ghostly pale, his skin glistening with a cold sweat, but his dark eyes fluttered open, locking onto hers with intense focus. He coughed, a weak, gravelly chuckle escaping his lips, defying the grim reality of their situation. "I told you, I needed a woman who could chop wood." "You stubborn fool," Joel sobbed, tears cutting clean tracks through the gray dust on her face. She immediately tore a long, clean strip of fabric from the hem of her flannel shirt, pressing it fiercely into his bullet wound to staunch the bleeding. "You brought the mountain down on us." Stefan gritted his teeth against the pain, nodding weakly toward the massive, immovable pile of collapsed boulders that now sealed them off from the main tunnel. Amos was entombed forever. The only way to be sure he wouldn't follow. "We're trapped," she realized, the claustrophobia finally sinking its claws into her chest as she looked at the dead end of their narrow hollow. "Not trapped," Stefan breathed, struggling to sit up, leaning his heavy frame against the cold granite wall. "I'm a miner, Josie. I don't build a dead end without a draft shaft." He raised a blood-stained finger, pointing toward the very back of the cavity, directly behind where her heavy brass trunk sat untouched. Move the trunk. Dig. For 3 agonizing hours, Joyle clawed at the packed dirt and loose stone at the back of the hollow, utilizing a broken pickaxe handle she found in the debris. Her newly calloused hands split and bled anew, her muscles screaming in exhaustion, but she did not stop. She dug with the ferocity of a woman who had finally found a life worth fighting for. Dawn was just breaking over the peaks when she finally widened the hole enough. With the last ounce of her strength, she dragged Stefan up through the narrow, steeply angled ventilation shaft, emerging onto a snowy, wind-swept ridge overlooking the ruins of their cabin. They collapsed together into the deep powder, the crisp, freezing mountain air filling their burning lungs like a blessing. Below them, the valley stretched out in pristine, sunlit beauty. The past was dead, buried under thousands of tons of rock, alongside the stolen wealth that had nearly ruined them. They had nothing left but the tattered clothes on their backs and a silver mine that would take months to clear. And yet, as Stefan reached over with his good arm, pulling Joyle tightly against his chest, they had never been richer. 6 months later, Ezekiel Farnsworth traveled up the repaired, widening mountain trail. The cabin had been rebuilt, far sturdier and larger than before, with thick glass windows that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Smoke curled happily from the stone chimney. Stephen Montgomery, his shoulder fully healed and his strength returned, was methodically splitting firewood in the yard. Joyle, now legally and truly Mrs. Josie Montgomery, stood on the wide front porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, surveying their hard-won empire. The mountain had demanded a heavy, brutal toll, but in its crucible, it had forged a love that no outlaw, no bitter winter, and no lawman could ever hope to break. If the thrilling tale of Stefan and Joyle's mountain survival kept you on the edge of your seat, we want to hear from you. Please drop a like, share this incredible Western romance with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more breathtaking, real-life-inspired dramas. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite plot twist, and don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss an upload.